The story of Josiah, the youngest king of Israel, is one of the most surprising and inspiring in Scripture. Imagine a boy of just 8 years old, barely out of childhood, being taken to the throne to rule an entire nation. How could someone so young face a kingdom plunged into chaos, where idolatry had corrupted the hearts of the people and God's temple lay in ruins? Josiah, a boy, still playing in the palace corridors, suddenly found himself with a crown on his head, something too big for his age. He had lost his father tragically. King Ammon, known for following the wrong path, full of idolatry and bad decisions, was murdered by his own servants. And so, from one day to the next, Josiah became king of Judah, a child on the throne of a kingdom that had long strayed from God's commandments. The people looked at him with uncertainty. How could such a young boy lead a nation? The streets of Jerusalem, full of altars to strange gods and practices that dishonored the Lord, they now had a new ruler, but no one knew what to expect. Would he follow his father's dark path? Or, who knows, you would find a different light. Even at such a young age, something about Josiah seemed different. He grew up under the influence of godly counselors, men who feared God and wanted to see Israel restored to its glory. And Josiah, with attentive ears and an open heart, began to realize that there was a greater calling for his life. But would it be possible? Could such a young boy, surrounded by so much corruption, be the key to changing the destiny of an entire nation? The early years of Josiah's reign were shaped by the wise voices around him. Although young, he was fortunate to be guided by counselors who knew God and wanted what was best for the people of Israel. These people, faithful and dedicated, served as beacons for the young king, lighting the way in a world full of darkness. They knew that Josiah's heart was pure and that, if directed correctly, he could be a king like no other before him. Josiah listened carefully to these voices. He wasn't just any boy. There was something about him, a thirst for justice, a desire to see his people prosper. Little by little, he came to understand that the throne was not just a position of power, but a responsibility. And unlike his predecessors, who had given in to corruption and idolatry, Josiah began to feel that his mission was to bring the people back to God's path. With each passing day, that restlessness inside him grew. He observed the idolatrous practices that had spread throughout the kingdom. Altars dedicated to strange gods occupied not only the squares, but also the hearts of the people. Josiah knew this could not continue. The weight of his mission was beginning to reveal itself, even if he still didn't know exactly how to act. At the age of 26, Josiah made a decision that would change the history of Israel forever. Restore the temple in Jerusalem. That one sacred place had been neglected for generations. Within its walls, silence had taken over, and dust covered the traces of a time when the people worshipped the true God. Josiah knew that this reform was necessary, but he did not imagine that this decision would reveal something much deeper. As workers cleaned the temple, removing rubble and repairing what time had destroyed, something unexpected happened. Hidden among the debris, they found an old scroll of parchment, dusty and forgotten. It was the book of the law, long lost and ignored by previous kings. Little did they know that that simple finding would have immeasurable consequences for Josiah and the entire nation. When the high priest Hilkiah gave the book to the scribe Shaphan, Josiah's heart was filled with curiosity. Shaphan read the contents to the king, and as the words resonated in the hall, Josiah felt something deep in his soul. What he heard was much more than laws and commandments. It was a painful reflection of how Israel had strayed from the covenant with God. Those words pierced Josiah's heart like sharp arrows, revealing the abyss into which his people had fallen. The consequences of the people's departure were clear, and Israel's destiny was marked by disobedience and idolatry. Josiah, in an act of deep repentance, tore his clothes. At that time, this gesture was a visible sign of pain, despair, and, above all, genuine regret. He could no longer ignore the truth before his eyes. The people were lost, far from God, and this needed to change. That young king, who had begun his reign surrounded by uncertainty, now felt the urgency to right the wrongs of entire generations. But how could he, alone, bring the people back? Idolatry was deeply rooted, not only in customs, but in the hearts of many. It was like an ancient tree, with deep roots that spread throughout the kingdom. However, Josiah knew he needed to act. He could not allow Israel to continue in this direction. Determined to do something great, Josiah decided to consult the prophetess Huldah, seeking to understand what God planned for the people. There was a lot at stake, and Huldah's answers would reveal more than he could imagine. After hearing the words of the prophetess Huldah, who confirmed how far Israel had strayed from God, Josiah made a courageous decision. He could no longer wait or be timid in his actions. It was time to act. Josiah, with a determined heart, began one of the greatest spiritual reforms the kingdom of Israel had ever seen. He was not limited to simple words or decrees. Josiah knew that for the people to return to God, he would have to eliminate the root of idolatry. And that's exactly what he did. With determination, Josiah ordered that all pagan idols and altars be destroyed. Every statue, every altar dedicated to strange gods, was torn down and reduced to dust. It was as if he was cleansing Israel of an invisible plague, rooting out every trace of disobedience that had contaminated the hearts of the people. The task was not easy. Idolatry was everywhere, present in small villages and even around the temple. Many kings before him had allowed these practices to flourish. But Josiah was not willing to leave anything behind. His mission was clear: to restore the true worship of God at any cost. But this purification was just the beginning. Josiah knew that tearing down the idols would not be enough. He knew that real change would come from a profound transformation, something that touched the hearts of the people and restored their faith. So he turned to the temple, the place that was supposed to be the center of worship of the true God. The temple, however, was in ruins, forgotten and stained by the pagan practices that had infiltrated it over the years. Josiah could not allow this to continue. Determined to bring glory back to the temple, Josiah ordered its complete purification. Every corner, every altar, every object that had been desecrated by foreign gods was removed. Those walls, which once echoed the prayers of the people of Israel, would now be restored to their original purpose, to be a place of sincere worship, a place where God's presence could be felt again. But Josiah didn't stop there. He went further, destroying pagan altars and shrines throughout the land, even outside of Judah. It was as if he wanted to ensure that every part of Israel was free from idolatry. His determination was relentless, and the people began to realize the seriousness of his reforms. With the temple purified and the pagan altars torn down, something more needed to be done. Josiah knew it was time to bring back a forgotten tradition, a powerful symbol of the covenant between God and his people. And it was then that he made the decision to restore Passover, the festival that symbolized Israel's liberation from slavery in Egypt. Josiah was determined to do these Easter as an event that people would never forget. He ordered the priests to prepare, the Levites to organize everything according to the ancient laws of Moses. The entire nation was called to participate. The temple, now purified, would be the setting for this grand celebration. For years, Easter had been neglected, left aside, and the people had moved away from their roots. But Josiah wanted to change that. He wanted everyone to remember the true God, the one who had freed their ancestors and who could still free them from the mistakes of the past. When Passover day arrived, Jerusalem was full of life. The sound of the Levites singing hymns echoed through the streets. The aroma of sacrifices rose to the sky, and the people, gathered en masse, celebrated as they hadn't done in a long time. Josiah participated in everything with a heart full of hope and faith. It was a moment of renewal, not just a party, but a promise of alliance. But although the people were involved in the celebration, not all hearts were truly transformed. And Josiah knew this. Something still needed to be done to ensure that this renewal was lasting. The Passover had been grand, something the people of Israel had not seen for generations. The temple, now restored, was filled with life and celebration. and the nation, for a brief moment, seemed to be in tune with God again. But Josiah, deep down, knew that not everything was resolved. He could see in the eyes of some, feel in the attitudes of others, that external change did not necessarily mean internal transformation. There was resistance, hidden in hearts that still felt attached to ancient customs and gods. Even though Josiah had torn down altars, destroyed idols, and restored worship in the temple, many in the kingdom still carried the old idolatry in their hearts. The roots of sin are not easy to uproot, and some remain firm, even in the face of so many reforms. The truth was that, for some, the pagan gods offered a false sense of comfort and power. They were not ready to completely let go of the past, and this worried Josiah deeply. The young king was faced with a dilemma. How could he ensure that this spiritual renewal was genuine and lasting? He knew that true faith could not be imposed by force or fear alone, but rather by a change of heart. Josiah had done everything in his power to show the people the way back to God, but he felt that something more still needed to be done. With this restlessness in his soul, Josiah made a bold decision. He would call on the people to renew the covenant with God, a pact that would unite the nation in obedience and faith. With this in mind, he summoned the entire nation to a solemn assembly. The king wanted everyone, from the most noble to the most humble, to be present for this historic moment. When the people gathered in Jerusalem, Josiah stood before them as a leader, not just as a king, but as one willing to lay down his life to restore Israel's glory. In front of everyone, he took the book of the law, the same book that had been rediscovered in the temple, and read its words aloud. It was a solemn moment. The silence that took over the crowd demonstrated the gravity of the occasion. God's ancient promises echoed, reminding everyone of the pact that had been made with their ancestors. At the end of the reading, Josiah did something audacious. He renewed his covenant with God, committing himself to follow the commandments with all his heart, with all his soul. But it didn't stop there. He also called the people to do the same. Everyone, without exception, promised to follow the Lord's ways, abandon idolatry once and for all, and honor the God who had freed them from Egypt. This moment, however, was just the beginning of a new challenge. Josiah knew that to ensure the success of his mission, he would need to expand his reforms beyond the borders of Judah. With the covenant renewed and the people committed to following God's ways, Josiah did not feel that his mission had been completely accomplished. He knew that evil did not respect borders, and that idolatry and spiritual corruption spread to lands beyond Judah. The ancient kingdom of Israel, which had been destroyed by the Assyrians, still carried deep traces of pagan practices. Josiah didn't hesitate. He decided that his reform should extend beyond the limits of his kingdom. So, with determination and faith, Josiah sent his men to the ancient lands of Israel. They traveled through villages and cities, tearing down the altars erected to pagan gods and destroying the shrines that had corrupted the people's faith. Each altar that fell was like an old wound being healed. For many, this seemed like an impossible attempt, but Josiah knew that true power was not in weapons and armies, but in obedience to the God of Israel. Reports of his campaign began to spread. It was impressive to see how a single man, with a pure and devout heart, was challenging centuries of idolatry and deep-rooted customs. Josiah was spiritually unifying a kingdom that had once been divided by rebellion and sin. However, his boldness caught the attention of the surrounding enemies. Egypt, a powerful nation and always keeping an eye on Israel's affairs, began to move. A new threat loomed on the horizon, and Josiah knew he would soon have to face more than pagan altars. As Josiah continued with his reforms, something unexpected began to happen in the region's political scene. Pharaoh Necho of Egypt was on the march with his army. He moved to help the Assyrians in a war against Babylon. For many kings, this would be a distant conflict, something that would not directly affect their kingdoms. But Josiah saw it differently. He believed that as king of Judah, his mission was to protect the land and people God had entrusted to him, and this included preventing Egypt from passing through his borders. Against all expectations, Josiah decided to face Necho. Many felt this was a battle he could not win. Egypt was one of the most powerful nations at the time, and Judah, although spiritually strengthened, did not have the same military power. Still, Josiah was determined. He believed that God was with him, and that his decision was just. After all, he had restored Israel's faith, destroyed the idols, and renewed the covenant with the Lord. Why wouldn't it be successful now? Necho, upon learning of Josiah's decision, tried to warn him. Pharaoh declared that his fight was not against Judah, and that he did not want war with the king of Israel. But Josiah, firm in his conviction, prepared for battle. He led his army to the valley of Megiddo, determined to stop the Egyptian advance. The stage was set, the swords were sharpened, and the fate of Josiah and his people would be decided on that battlefield. The battle in the valley of Megiddo, it was a decisive moment in Josiah's life. He marched with courage, with a heart full of faith, but also with a great responsibility on his shoulders. In his heart, Josiah believed he was doing God's will, protecting Judah from an imminent threat. However, the course of events would take a tragic turn. Amid the chaos of battle, Josiah was struck by an arrow. The impact was devastating. His desperate men took the king from the battlefield, but the injuries were serious. News that Josiah, the king who had restored faith in Israel, was seriously injured spread quickly. He was taken back to Jerusalem, but his wounds were fatal. Josiah died shortly afterwards, leaving the people in a state of shock. Josiah's death was an immense loss for Judah. The king who had led the people back to God, who had destroyed the pagan altars and renewed the covenant, was now dead. The sound of the lament echoed through the streets of Jerusalem. The people mourned for him not only as their ruler, but as a spiritual leader who guided them back to the path of truth. But with his death, the history of Israel would take another turn. The kings who would come after Josiah did not follow your steps. Judah, once again, would begin to go astray, and the nation's future would hang in the balance. Josiah's legacy, however, endures. His life is a powerful reminder that, even in the face of immense challenges, faith, courage, and obedience to God can change the destiny of a nation, even if for a time. Josiah's death on the battlefield marked the end of a reign that had given hope to the people of Judah. He was the king who, even at such a young age, decided to fight against the darkness that dominated his nation. From the beginning, Josiah demonstrated a rare courage, a determination that his reign would be different. He was not content to be just a king of power, but he desired to be the king who led his people back to the light of God. His acts, such as the restoration of the temple and the destruction of the idols, were more than physical reforms. They were profound gestures from someone who understood that true change begins in the heart, that first of all it is necessary to return to God. Josiah teaches us that, faced with a corrupt culture that is far from its values, it is possible to resist and make a difference, even if it seems like a lonely fight. He did not wait for others to follow him, led with faith and action. However, his life also reminds us that not all battles are won by strength. Josiah faced Pharaoh Necho, believing he was acting correctly, but his early death suggests that, even with all his faith, we do not always fully understand God's plans. Sometimes, in our quest to do what is right, we are called to trust, even when the outcome is not what we expected. Josiah's story invites us to reflect on leadership, faith, and courage. He teaches us that genuine transformation requires sacrifice and determination, but also humility to recognize that, in the end, everything is in God's hands. It's a reminder that even when our actions seem small in the face of chaos, they have the power to leave an eternal legacy. If you like Josiah's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible